Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Kimposium, the sequel. I'm Meredith Jones. As you know, this is our final set of sessions for the program. We've got some real treats in store, and I'm looking forward to every single thing that's coming up. It's afternoon for me in London. I know it's different times for many of you all over the world. So the title of this session is simply Sexuality. We have two papers, and as usual, we'll listen to each of them. I'll introduce them each in turn. We'll listen to each of them, and then we'll save our questions for the end. In the meantime, though, do feel free to put up comments in the chat. Also, you can ask questions in the chat if you're unable or don't want to use the voice function later on. So we're going to get started straight away with our first presenter. This is ARIANNE Goodell. The title of this paper is, quote, "No aerial shots, please," unquote. I think that's a quote from the only, as far as we know, sex tape with Kim. So that's the first part of the title. And the second part is the moral limits of Kardashian sexuality. So ARIANNE is pursuing a master's degree in New Humanities at the New School for Social Research. Her interests are in post-feminist sexuality and how it manifests on Instagram and Facebook. Oh, not Facebook, sorry, just added that in, on Instagram and beyond. She's written about Kylie Jenner fan pages and about social media filters as a gimmick. And she lives in Brooklyn with her partner and two cats. So I'll hand over to you, ARIANNE.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. Sexuality is integral to the Kardashian brand, and yet nothing is too sacred for the family to monetize, but sex itself. If their fame and allure rests on the fact that they almost but never do show us everything, it also rests on a moralist distinction between this almost but not quite versus full-on pornography. It goes without saying that this is a hypocritical distinction, and I doubt the notion that Kim Kardashian has made a career out of her body and appearance should incite debate. Even though she leaked her sex tape in 2004, setting off her career and making Keeping Up with the Kardashians a hit, she has since said she regrets it, would take it back, and only did it because she was on ecstasy. Kylie Jenner said in a Snapchat story a few years ago, "You're never going to see a sex tape from me. It's never going to happen." Implicit in these statements, as well as others the sisters have made on their show, is that they position themselves and what they do on a moral high ground above sex work and those who engage in it. Throughout my essay, the term sex work encompasses everything from prostitution to porn acting, including solo porn. What sets apart what the Kardashians do, marketing their sexuality, from selling sex or sex content? It isn't just a moralist distinction, although that is crucial, and they love to be the arbiters of traditional Christian family values. The Kardashian brand of sexuality is also rooted in a post-feminist ideal subjecthood of a woman who looks great, feels great, and depends on no one. Through analyzing work on post-feminist digital cultures, neoliberal feminism, and sex and labor, I will show that Kardashian success and sexuality speak not only to our culture's moralism around sexuality, but also to notions of women's labor and empowerment in the current moment. So before I get into post-feminist ideology, just a note on my discussion of sex work and the figure of the sex worker. As Juno Mack and Molly Issa Smith write in their book, Revolting Prostitutes, feminist theory has been far more interested in the symbol of the sex worker and what it means for other women than in improving the material conditions of sex work so as to ensure women's safety, regardless of their work and choices. It is not my intention to focus on the symbol of the sex worker, but rather to illuminate the ways in which the cultural imaginary of the sex worker as abject other allows for the idolization of certain non-sex worker women who appropriate certain aesthetics of the former for their own success and appeal. What are the conditions that make Kim a celebrity, but someone who sells sex objected? And how will that change with things like OnlyFans? What interests me is this gap in the culture between girl power, love your body discourses and the recently increasing popularity and normalization of sex work, especially with the rise of OnlyFans and increasingly commonplace sugar daddy arrangements. As the culture changes and young women grow more comfortable with commodifying their sexuality, the distinction between sex work and what the Kardashians do may become obsolete. The purpose of this essay is not to make any judgment on the former, but rather to call out this moralist distinction and look at the ways in which neoliberal post-feminist ideology is at play within these tensions. So my use of the term post-feminism refers to a cultural shift starting in the 1990s, whereby feminism comes to be seen as a thing of the past, redundant, no longer useful. Either out of an aversion to the perceived shrill, rigid character of feminism, or out of a notion that gender equality has been achieved, at least to a satisfying degree, young women now recall but reject feminist values. This is the theory put forth by scholars such as Angela McRobbie, Yvonne Tasker, and Diane Negra, most notably. There's a kind of irony at play in post-feminist portrayals and self-representation of women, an understanding to some degree of the politics and the sexualization of women's fashion and bodies at the same time as that sexualization remains a central quality in popular media. Indeed, post-feminism's emphasis on beauty, glamour, sexiness, and fitness can be found in all forms of popular media and especially social media. Catherine Rottenberg prefers the term neoliberal feminism over post-feminism, which is another helpful way of thinking about the emphasis on the individual. To paraphrase Wendy Brown, neoliberalism is the casting of every action and decision one makes in entrepreneurial and economic terms, basing one's life on calculations of cost-benefit analysis to achieve optimal results and happiness. For Rottenberg, this kind of calculation requires constant self-monitoring. Aspirations of fitness, attractiveness, success, and a harmonious work-family balance often shape women's lives under neoliberal feminism. Yet because of the focus on career, the work-family balance is nothing more than an attractive myth. Really, more work is the goal. Because of this, family issues within culture and sexual politics remain unaddressed, and the turn towards the individual blocks collective action. Characteristic also of neoliberal or post-feminism is the ideal of the woman as consumer and the equation of consumption with happiness and success. Products that help women achieve career, fitness, and beauty goals drive Instagram advertising, and celebrities like the Kardashians make extra cash by promising that these products will make viewers more like them. Kim Kardashian, the mega successful, mega ambitious, independent, but absolutely devoted to her now ex-husband and her children. Super sexy, but not cheap or easy, is the post-feminist dream girl. Working hard, taking care of oneself, and valuing family relationships are major themes in the Kardashian brand. Monogamy, even with consistently unfaithful partners, motherhood, and sisterhood define Kardashian femininity. There's also this notion in post-feminism and in neoliberalism in general that it's not work if you're doing what you love. The commonality of unpaid internships that rely on the idea that free labor is worth it in the long run for one's future goals or for the pursuit of passion is exemplary here. But it also applies to the job of living life on camera and selling self-care products. In his book, Reality TV, The Work of Being Watched, Mark Andrzejewicz suggests that part of the attraction of reality TV is the promise that anyone can become famous by exposing themselves in their daily lives. He wrote the book in 2003 when webcam sites were becoming increasingly popular as people could satisfy their voyeurism through watching strangers live their lives. Being able to make money on cameras, by leaving cameras on in your house as you go about your day changed many people's conception of what labor is and should be. It wasn't just that people could work at home, but he writes, quote, domestic activities that didn't used to generate value could be captured, recorded, and commodified thanks to the extended reach of the monitoring gaze facilitated by the digital enclosure, end quote. Domesticity, leisure time, and labor merge, promising to restore this harmonious work-life balance, which of course is the very thing lean-in feminists so dream of. But this notion of balance, as Andrzejewicz says, hides the real point that more time is spent generating value. I would add that this incidentally leads to the impulse to make every moment and every decision a value-generating one. Then there's a false promise that the reality TV era, that the idea that anyone and everyone has access, not just to this kind of labor, but has the chance of making it in this kind of economy. What determines whose lives are interesting enough for a reality show and who has to masturbate on campsites for money? For whom is it still always labor, and for whom is it just living life or even just self-care? The moralist classist distinction that makes the Kardashians glamorous and cam girls naive crumbles when one realizes that all of the above content is, in a sense, pornographic. Frederick Jameson's famous quote, "The visual is essentially pornographic," comes to mind. Since reality TV's inception, its allure has always had to do with a kind of voyeurism. Something appeals to viewers about watching the spectrum of mundane to dramatic in the everyday lives of other people. This is, as we all know, a major part of the Kardashian effect. Unlike other celebrities and influencers, we as viewers are under the impression that we're getting the real version of their family life. Having myself watched many seasons of Keeping Up, I admit that even I feel I know the family well, almost intimately. The Spectacle of the Real, a book adapted from a conference here at Brunel in 2003, articulates the seductiveness of reality as spectacle and spectacle as reality in entertainment and media, ranging from the early reality show Big Brother to the live broadcasting of Princess Diana's marriage and death and of 9/11. In an essay titled Media Culture and the Triumph of the Spectacle, contributor Douglas Kellner makes a particularly relevant claim. Quote, "To become a celebrity requires recognition as the star player in the field of media spectacle," end quote. While spectacle in the celebrity world often means scandal, there's a way in which one can manipulate one's scandal to their own benefit with a good public relations team. As Guy Debord writes in his influential work, Society of the Spectacle, the spectacle is not a collection of images. It is a social relation between people that is mediated by images. But for women, it's always been a fine tightrope to walk. One recalls Janet Jackson's exposure at the Super Bowl in 2004. And of course, I would be remiss not to mention Bill Clinton's impeachment scandal, which made Monica Lewinsky the laughingstock of the country for a time. Yet for Kim, her sex scandal made her career. One woman's astronomical error is another woman's key to success. The difference here is control of the narrative and the representation. The title of this paper, No Aerial Shots Please, is a quote from Kim's sex tape, denoting this control of representation, her manipulation of how she is perceived, which is now a constant in her life. This brings us back to Catherine Rottenberg's point about constant self-monitoring. Rather than conceptualizing the self-monitoring as harmful to girls and women, in post-feminist culture, it conveys power through control of one's narrative. Here we find the irony of post-feminist representation, whereby feminist media critiques are taken into account, but not applicable insofar as the woman sexualizing herself seems to be doing it of her own volition, which always seems to imply a sense of empowerment. Herein lies the difference between OnlyFans or camgirling versus what is referred to as revenge porn, the unfortunately common occurrence of someone's private sex act or nude picture being shared or posted without their consent. The distinction between leaking one's sex tape and having one's sex tape leaked speaks to our cultural understandings of sex work versus the various forms of labor we deem worthy of being real work, which are sometimes paradoxically framed as not being work because it's really just doing what you love. In Revolting Prostitutes, Mack and Smith write about the ideology behind anti-sex work sentiments. At the foundation of this anti-sex work or anti-prostitution feminist thought, brought forth by scholars like Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon, is this essentialist idea that as a woman, sex with men always means letting oneself be dominated or oppressed. If men want to be able to do whatever they want to women's bodies, sex workers in this view are just making themselves available for such a service. So anti-prostitution feminists see sex workers as being overtly complicit with male domination and female subservience. And it feeds into this notion that sex is too sacred to be commodified. The reality that sex workers often do set boundaries with clients is overlooked by the harmful stereotype that sex work is purchased consent. This idea of purchased consent is incompatible, of course, with self-empowerment, which causes a rift with neoliberal feminism. Selling sex is typically equated with not being in control, and that's not the image that people like Kim Kardashian want for themselves. But we're starting to see that change. Now young women are capitalizing on their sex appeal and confidence to become financially independent. In fact, I would argue that OnlyFans is a logical continuation of the post-feminist brand of sexuality one sees all over Instagram, which the Kardashians helped build. The cultural obsession with looking hot, posting bikini or lingerie pictures, having a big butt, or taking a picture at the right angle to make one's butt look big, has helped women influencers make money in all sorts of ways for some years. Now the culture has taken the next step. There's an economic imperative with inaccessible and rising tuition rates, but I would also say that people want to see more and people want to show more skin, which OnlyFans permits. And as many of you know, the company recently decided to stop allowing porn content, but then realized they would lose a lot of money and went back on it. The realization that one can commodify one's body and the normalization of doing so has led college-aged girls into sugar daddy arrangements as well. So what is lost when we come to accept this reality? What do we hold on to when we insist upon a distinction between sexual self-representation and sex work, when it's all essentially commodification of the self, which is the new mode of employment under late capitalism anyway? So far, my essay, I don't know why it's not going to the next slide. So far, my essay has addressed the contradiction in Kardashian and other celebrity sexuality about what kinds of bodily labor are acceptable or respectable. I base my thinking within an anti-work school of thought. The problem lies not in what kinds of labor people do, but that everyone is compelled to work in what Kathy Weeks calls the work society, and that certain people have fewer options. Anyone who has read literature on sex work probably knows that trans women are overrepresented in the sex worker population because their job opportunities are otherwise limited. But there's another issue that I've hoped to address regarding representation. Post-feminist ideology, although it has really taken off in popular media, has also had an impact in gender studies. The decreasing popularity of feminist theory, coupled with the avoidance of referring to women as a category for fear of pushing bioessentialist ideas of gender, has meant a reluctance to address everyday gender politics and the often harmful effects that Instagram and other social media have on women's and girls' lives. It's a tricky topic to begin with. As Amy Shields Dobson writes, when commentary about girls and young women's digital media practices and self-representations does not fuel moral panics about their safety and well-being, it often mocks their interests and abilities in cultural production. Dobson puts forth the question, what might we as feminist scholars miss entirely with quick initial reactions to girls and young women's online engagement? Taking them seriously as cultural producers means understanding that individuals' choices are influenced by all sorts of external as well as internal factors, and may be rooted in the desire to get by, a la Lauren Berlant and their capitalist life worlds. The cultural studies style of analysis is useful because it typically avoids judgment or condemnation, but rather asks questions about cultural and political influence, and how and why certain trends stick or work and have such a wide-reaching impact. Feminist media scholars like the ones I've mentioned still critically engage with gender politics and representation, but I've noticed pushback from popular online and academic discourse. There's a tension between addressing questions of sexual representation and defending women's right to sexual labor and sexual autonomy. My attempt in writing this essay and in my work in general is to articulate a critique of post-feminist love your body discourses that takes up allegiance with the urgent project of decriminalizing sex work and promoting sex workers' rights. I argue that it is possible to depart from anti-sex work feminism altogether while enacting a critique of post-feminism and neoliberal feminism and the ways in which their ideologies can be found in popular sex work today, such as in OnlyFans. Kim Kardashian epitomizes the marriage of neoliberal feminism's focus on work and empowerment through career with post-feminism's focus on empowerment through having a good body and being sexually attractive. For anti-capitalists, what would resistance to that marriage look like? What if we position OnlyFans as the love child of that happy marriage? Is resistance possible through that very platform? To reiterate, sex work is work like any other job under capitalism. The problem is not with sex work. The question is whether these problematic ideals for women in the 21st century have some influence in popular forms of sex work today, and how to push against those ideals without contributing to harmful anti-sex work discourses. The reluctance of scholars of feminist theory and feminist media studies to address these questions means that the contradictions in pop culture, sexuality remain unexamined, and debates around self-representation remain in the past, when there's arguably no better time to engage in them than right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Well done. Beautiful work. Such a very fine and sophisticated reading of two enormous areas of interest for new feminist work. Thank you so much. We'll get into it in the chat, but in the question time. In the meantime, we need to move on to our second paper for the session. This paper is titled Kardashian Conversations Around the Kootchie, and the presenter is SIRI LINDHOLM. SIRI is an associate lecturer and a PhD candidate in cultural studies at London College of Fashion. Her PhD concerns itself with early millennial media discourses about sexualized girls' dress in the pre-Me Too era, and the ways that those often appeared to uphold ideas of inappropriateness, shame, and victim blaming. Over the course of COVID, SIRI has been a visiting researcher at Aalto University in Helsinki, where her research is centered around women, the body, and the physicality of childbirth. So I'll hand over to you, SIRI, and welcome.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to start. Thank you, Arianne, so much. I can't wait to talk more afterwards because there are so many overlaps. I'm just loving the continuity of this idea of the body as in the center of this. So, and thank you so much also for that introduction. I'm just going to jump right in. So I originally set out to write this paper covering conversations in keeping up with the Kardashians that have to do with all aspects of women's reproductive health. But it really ended up being about surrogate pregnancy. And so what I want to do here is I'm going to start by investigating general discourses in keeping up about periods, sex, contraception, vaginal health, and childbirth. And then I'm going to use about half of this paper to examine in more detail the conversations that are had about surrogacy in keeping up with the Kardashians. So all of my interest in reproduction started when I got stuck in my home country of Finland during the pandemic. And one of the first things that I noticed in the press here was this enormous discourse around falling birth rates. And so Gallup, after a study was done, asking millennial women about their relationships, their familial ties, their childhoods, their work situation, their finances, etc., etc. These social reasons were covered head to toe, but the one thing that nobody seemed to be addressing was the physicality of reproduction. So no one was asking women how they thought that being pregnant and especially giving birth might affect their health, their physical, and physically their long-term quality of life. So I started looking into this, and I don't want to veer off topic now. So my point is that I've written about the Kardashians before, investigating women and dress, and I really started noticing a ton of overlap in topics that are covered in Keeping Up and discourses around women, the body, and childbirth. So I'm going to start now with different random examples in Keeping Up where there are conversations about women's reproductive health, and then through these, I'm going to come to surrogacy specifically. So I find one of the most interesting aspects of keeping up this kind of contradiction in, I guess you could call it ideology, where on one hand, there are so many patriarchal aspects of the world that the Kardashian sisters inhabit, from their hyper heterosexualized, really pornified aesthetics, which ARIANNE was talking about, and their extreme participation in neoliberal capitalism. Again, thank you, ARIANNE, for taking this up. And then the nostalgic worship of late Robert Kardashian as the head of the family, and also the way that they cater to their male partners. However, Kardashian-Jenner clan is very much an active matriarchy, with Kris Jenner as the material and immaterial head of the family. Moreover, the presence of the five sisters appears to have been extremely fertile ground for having very frank conversations about women's reproductive health in a way that was simply not yet usual after the turn of the millennium, when Keeping Up with the Kardashians started filming in 2007. So one of the earliest of these conversations that come to mind is the episode where Kendall Jenner has potentially gotten her period. The sisters gather around and give animated advice on how to use pads and tampons, while the embarrassed Kendall tries to sink into the sofa. What I find is significant about this exchange is that it is done lightheartedly, with endless laughter and humor, and without any kind of stigma. And I would argue that this was still really rather abnormal in 2007, and that it went some way to normalize the discourse around periods and menarche. Moving on, the maintenance of pubic hair has also enjoyed very liberal coverage on Keeping Up with the Kardashians. There is the episode on Kourtney and Khloe Take Miami, where Kourtney tries to give Khloe a bikini wax, which ends up burning her vulva. And in a later episode, when Kourtney is pregnant, she enlists her partner Scott to help her shave her pubic hair in a bathtub, as she cannot reach due to the baby bump. There is, of course, the discourse around how the removing of pubic hair fits in with feminist ideology in general. However, bringing visible bodily maintenance, which usually remains hidden, I think is definitely important. This taboo creates manifold problems where girls might feel that their body hair is abnormal, while their male partners might think that young women are hairless by nature, thus upholding sexist stereotypes and pornified aesthetic in the search for a partner. Another example that comes to mind in spin-off Kourtney and Khloe Take the Hamptons, where pregnant Kourtney is doing a kind of twerky movement with her hips, and Khloe asks her why she is fidgeting. Kourtney answers that she has a mild yeast infection, and that for some reason, every time she is expecting, she gets an igi vagine. She does say that she doesn't know why this happens, but she's clearly referring to the imbalance in vaginal flora caused by hormonal changes during pregnancy. This was the first time I had heard anyone discuss yeast infections on TV, and this was in 2014. If we continue a little bit further with Kourtney Kardashian and start inching towards the topic of childbirth, Kourtney's own participation in her vaginal delivery is quite extraordinary. After she had delivered the upper body of her baby, she grabbed it under the arms and pulled it out onto her chest. While I'm not equipped to comment on this from a medical point of view, I think there is great significance in empowering women, firstly by showing the birth, thus destigmatizing it, and secondly by showing a woman's active participation in her own labor, which can be overwhelmed by medical staff giving orders and taking over care. Kourtney's openness about the physical aspects of breastfeeding continue after the birth. One instance comes to mind where Kourtney concludes a business meeting by declaring that she needs to head home now because my boobs are about to explode. Khloe then explains to her male business partner that this is just so that you know because Kourtney is breastfeeding. I find this exchange significant because of the ease with which Kourtney declared that she needed to go home to breastfeed or to pump. She made no allowances for the male associate to feel uncomfortable. But what is also telling in the situation, though, is Khloe's explanation. So on one hand, Kourtney refuses to pander to the stigma around breastfeeding, but on the other hand, Khloe does acknowledge that it exists and relieves possible confusion and tension by explaining what is going on. Later, we see an image of Kourtney's Instagram of her breastfeeding in a glamorous dressing room, which again, I find an interesting combination of hypersexualized pop culture paired with a feminist message about the physicality of postpartum. I remember this coinciding with a British media discourse around the low rates of breastfeeding in teenage mothers. I also recall a documentary from around the time in which a teenage mother was interviewed in a very patronizing tone about why she wasn't breastfeeding her child. The teenager then answered with embarrassment in her voice that maybe if celebrities did it, she would too. She had, after all, dyed her hair stark red because Rihanna had red hair. So maybe if Rihanna breastfed, she would breastfeed as well. I find this comparison to be infinitely important in exposing many a missing discourse. It first of all demonstrates the double bind that women, especially teenage mothers, are in many places, where breastfeeding still comes under major pressure from health authorities, while there is a huge stigma around breastfeeding publicly. Secondly, it also shows a complete lack of understanding from health services in how to frame practices in such a way that they are understood and resonate with the different demographic. Because you can give a girl a pamphlet and lecture her on her baby's vitamin deficiency, but it's never going to be as effective as showing Kourtney Kardashian pumping breast milk in designer jeans. So I am going to now move on to discussing surrogate pregnancies in keeping up with the Kardashians specifically. So Kim Kardashian conceived her two youngest children by a surrogate in 2018 and 2019. Kim gave birth to her first two children herself. However, these were not straightforward pregnancies or deliveries. While Kim was pregnant with her first child, the show documented the problems she had in her pregnancy. She suffered from excessive water retention and eventually became preeclamptic and had to be induced early. Her birth was not uncomplicated. The placenta got stuck and had to be scraped off her uterine wall by the doctor. When Kim tells of her delivery to Jonathan, she says, "He literally put his entire arm inside me to pull out the placenta." After her second pregnancy, Kim has to undergo uterine surgery, which leaves her with a catheter. We see pictures here of her OBGYN giving her a pelvic exam, and then later on trying to remove the catheter after she is still unable to pass urine on her own. I could go into further medical detail, but I don't think it's necessary in demonstrating just how invasive these gynecological procedures were that Kim underwent and just how much discomfort they caused. The physical involvement here in reproduction was really tremendous. Despite all of these interventions, however, infertility ensued, and Kim was no longer able to carry or give birth to her own children. If we look at the Kardashian sisters' reproductive practices, we notice that some reproductive events are insourced, so to speak, whereas some are outsourced to labs and to other women. So we have a mixture of physical involvement. When it comes to Kim, she insourced her first two pregnancies while outsourcing the labor and delivery of her subsequent two. She did, however, insource the genetics of her two latter pregnancies, which in practice means that she provided the egg and her husband the sperm. She would have endured the very physical and painful aspects of egg retrieval. The fertilization was then outsourced to a lab and the pregnancy and delivery to a surrogate. So we have a mixture of physical involvement here. I find this quite interesting because a similar pattern seems to be reflected in her non-physical or immaterial psychological involvement in her surrogacies. This can be evidenced in a conversation that she has with Khloe in season 20, so in the very last season. Khloe is told by doctors that it would be high risk for her to carry another pregnancy to term. She thus considers surrogacy and asks Kim about her relationship and involvement in her surrogacies. Kim responds that with the first surrogacy, she was very involved and invited the surrogates into her home and kept in close contact throughout, which we can see in the pictures here on the slide. I wonder if this may be a sign of two things. So maybe because Kim had previously birthed her children herself, she saw motherhood's physicality as a personal aspect. She therefore created a similar an experience for herself and her family in physically bringing the surrogate and gestating the gestating child sort of physically into her home. By the time she was expecting her second child by a surrogate, she tells Chloe, "I was so chill, I didn't even need to meet her. I was like, you just do your thing." So I see this as reflective of two aspects. Again, the positive experience of the first surrogacy allowed her to let go of control, but also she may not have been physically involved in the second surrogate pregnancy at all anymore. It may be that for her second surrogacy, she would not have needed a new egg retrieval, as the lab might have been able to use ones left over from a previous retrieval or frozen embryos. This means that she would not have needed any physical involvement in her second surrogacy. And I wonder if this lack of physicality resulted in a more profound distancing from the physical side of reproduction altogether. So in a general sense, this could be seen as the wealthy mother, women of the middle and upper classes, slowly but surely outsourcing unpleasant physical tasks to women of lower socioeconomic backgrounds, thus cementing their membership in the intellectual class. By removing herself from the labor market, and yes, this is a deliberate play on words, but I want to make the point here again about the physicality of childbirth and of pregnancy. So when you remove yourself from the labor market, the wealthy woman is able to maintain her health, her figure, her participation in the economy, rearing her existing children and her free time, without disruption of physical unpleasantness. Ill health brought upon by reproduction or injury resulting from childbirth. This can be compared to practices like wet nursing in the last few centuries. Ultimately, by outsourcing her baby making, her risk of death decreases as well, and she can thus be seen to be making safer choices for her already existing children and their welfare. The problem is, however, that this does not eliminate any of the dangers of the physicality of reproduction. They are simply transferred. In the case of Kim and Khloe Kardashian, this equation becomes more complex. They do not only outsource pregnancy due to financial ability, but also due to the physical limitation of their bodies. The surrogate in this case is the more able-bodied woman for the task. This poses an ethical contradiction and challenge. It is widely accepted in society that labor is divided according to physical ability. However, we do not apply the same rationale to birthing. It is still the norm that women in heterosexual relationships carry their own children, even though they may have to endure complex medical intervention and support, resulting in extreme discomfort, pain, and injury in order to do so. There are, of course, myriad ethical considerations with a topic like surrogacy far beyond the reach of this paper. However, I do want to touch upon the subject of compensation. Kim Kardashian presumably used a commercial surrogate who would have been paid for her services, as well as having her medical expenses covered. This is not legal in the UK, where surrogates can only have their expenses covered. This is, and very importantly so, to protect vulnerable women from having their bodies exploded. What I find interesting, however, is that we only begun to speak of women's physical exploitation when it comes to childbirth, once the task was outsourced to a second party. If women birth children for their own families, they are not seen to deserve compensation because women's labor is not labor. And excuse the play on words again. Taking on the physical task and the risks associated with carrying and birthing a child are ignored until someone else does it for you. The task, however, remains the same. In many other areas, we have begun to recognize and to compensate women for their labor. Domestic work is actively seen as work, and in many countries it is compensated for financially with tax breaks or direct benefits. Meta work, the invisible labor often taken on by mothers in the home, budgeting, booking, preempting, reminding, and arranging is gaining more and more awareness as an active contribution to societal welfare, because studies have shown how the lack of meta work makes family life much more expensive. It seems like the physicality of childbirth is one of the last bastions in accepting women's contributions to society as work. And this is a landscape that is rapidly changing as technology like artificial wombs are developing fully. So to conclude, if we come back once more to the conversation between Kim and Khloe in the last season of Keeping Up, when Chloe thinks about expanding her family with the help of a surrogate and thus consults a specialist lawyer. During the conversation, legal boundaries are explained to Chloe, and one facet of the arrangement becomes particularly central. If the surrogate mother is transferred multiple embryos for a better chance of one of them implanting, and thus starts a multiple pregnancy. Hold on, where am I? So if the surrogate mother is transferred multiple embryos for a better chance of one of them implanting and thus starts a multiple pregnancy, it is within the rights of the surrogate mother to abort one or more in order for her to waive the risks of carrying a multiple pregnancy to term. Chloe is taken aback by this and expresses that she's uncomfortable with someone else being awarded that level of control over her family planning. To this, the lawyer answers conclusively, yes, it is your child, but it is her body. And I will conclude with these words, and thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you so much, SIRI. I remember being really astonished by Chloe's astonishment that the surrogate actually had the right to do that. Thanks for such a good paper, so in depth, so interesting, so carefully considered. Okay, so we have time for questions, for compliments in the chat for our two speakers, for hands up if you like. I'm looking there. Okay, we do have a question. It's from Colton Lee, and it's for Arianne. I'll read it out. Despite the increasing rise of the popularity of OnlyFans, Keeping Up with the Kardashians remains accessible in different ways, namely by the Kardashians being on virtually every platform, including television. Can you speak more to the counter-argument of how or why the moral distinction that the Kardashians have will ensure that they will always be relevant and have a consumer audience?
That's a really good question. Thank you, Colton. So the question is, despite this moral distinction and if the Kardashians don't embrace OnlyFans and this kind of work, they'll still always be relevant. I don't know if they will, but you know, I think there was a presentation yesterday about how Kim is always reinventing herself, and there are numerous ways that the Kardashians keep their audience excited and paying attention, and definitely this this teasing, a friend of mine called it like edging of the audience, that like never giving you everything you want to see, but always giving you kind of a taste, is really exciting in a lot of ways to viewers and to audience members. So yeah, I think that I guess that the appeal of that will probably remain, but I don't know if I can really make predictions about the future.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So I have a question that could be for both of you. There's a scene in one of the episodes in, I think, series 5, where Mason's just been born, but Bruce, who was Bruce in season 5, is showing us around the house, or showing a friend around the house. And he shows his friend a portrait of pregnant Courtney, which is on the bedroom wall of the bedroom he shares with Chris. And he says, and here is a pornographic picture of my daughter. And I think Chris hears and she says, that is not pornography. So, and I think there are multiple places in the program where they actually discuss in different ways between themselves those moral boundaries. So, you know, I think either one of you could speak to that, the ways that boundary is continually being actually reworked and you know, negotiated through the characters themselves.
Yeah, can I say something on that? Because I remember that episode really well, because it's the one where Bruce sleeps in the garage at the end because he's been banished. And there was a paper yesterday that talked about race as well, and it really made me think about how it's not what you do, it's who does it that kind of categorizes it, whether it is pornographic or whether it is acceptable performance of gendered femininity, etc., etc. So it seems that when you have a certain amount of money and certain kind of status, it really, you are the one who makes the rules. So it becomes non-pornographic.
Yeah, absolutely. Arianne, did you want to comment on that?
Sure, yeah. Well, there's in the earlier seasons, there's a lot of moments of Caitlyn kind of being just so offended and uncomfortable and scorning all of the daughters' sexuality, sexual expression. And there's the famous, like, I think in the first season, when they get a stripper's pole in the house and Kylie and Kendall are playing with it, and Caitlyn comes in and gets so angry, and you wonder if Caitlyn is supposed to be the kind of, like, you know, in the production of the show, in the writing of the show, if Caitlyn is supposed to be kind of the straight man, so to speak, to their hypersexual expression. Yeah, I don't know. I think that would be an interesting question to look into. Caitlyn's role in those early seasons, especially. I think at some point she had to come to accept that's the family brand. Like, that's like the way it goes. You know, you can't tell the Kardashians to not be sexy all the time. But there was a post from Kim, I think I might have included it in my presentation, or no, I was going to, where she posted and she said, my Aunt Shelley yelled at me when she saw that I posted this pic, so I blurred out the nipples, like, sorry, Aunt Shelley. And yeah, there's this kind of like acknowledgement of it, but real pride in it that I think is interesting.
Yeah, totally. Someone said that, Lauren B has said that after seeing Kourtney pull her baby out of herself, she actually had the confidence or whatever it was to reach down and feel her baby's head as her baby came out of her, which, you know, speaks to the breastfeeding point. You know, if celebrities do it, then it kind of makes it acceptable for everyone else to do it.
I think it's also, sorry.
Just Mallory's put up a similar point that they learn more about pregnancy from Keeping Up with the Kardashians than, you know, other sources.
And I think they have such an interesting sort of balance between the organicness of some of their reproductive practices, like vaginal childbirth and breastfeeding. And then it goes to the other extreme, where they have very open conversations with their gynecologists about freezing eggs and sort of major interventions into reproduction. So it really, you get the full scale in the show.
Yeah, that's right.
It's great that it isn't like one is stigmatized and the other one is romanticized. They really kind of romanticize the full scale of, let's just all reproduce as much as we can.
Yeah, but both can also have their shocking elements, can't they? You know, we've been talking a lot through the symposium about authenticity, and one of the few times where I've been utterly convinced of the authenticity of something on the program was the look on Chris's face as she sees Kourtney pull the baby out. It's a look of utter shock. It's a look of a woman who had never thought of doing such a thing. And it kind of, it was really, really striking to me that Chris was shocked too.
There was also, I forget which season it was, but before Courtney gives birth to, I guess, Mason, she convinces Chloe to come with her to watch some random woman give birth at home in a tub. And Chloe is like horrified by it. She's like, thinks it's so gross and weird. And so it's like maternity is such a big thing for the Kardashians, but it's childbirth is like, for them, I think, preferably a very sterile kind of medical, traditional Western thing. Like it's not, I mean, Courtney is an exception that she's really into the kind of wellness stuff. And, but I just thought that was interesting that they went there to learn more about home birth and water births, and they left horrified and like totally weirded out.
But I would actually almost disagree that they kind of sterilized childbirth, because I find it really quite bizarre how many people are always around when they give birth. So it becomes this like communal, very sort of matriarchal event for them. If it was sterilized, yeah, there are no elective cesareans, for example. I mean, yes, there are surrogates, but yeah, in that sense, they do deliver vaginally, and they do it communally.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was it was particularly performative when Chloe gave birth to True, with Kim actually going like this behind Tristan's back. And, that was really, really performative, and really very much for the cameras too. Do we have any more questions? Please feel free. It can be a discussion, it can be questions, it can be hands up, it can be things in the chat.
Well, actually, I could ask Arianne, you mentioned somebody whose last name was Dobson. That was very interesting. Who was that? Can you just tell me?
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat. Amy Shields Dobson. Her book is Post-Feminist Digital Cultures, and then there's a subtitle. I forget what it is.
Yeah,
I'll put it in the chat.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, no, because I really enjoyed when you brought up the ongoing discourses about woman as a category, which have been kind of raging over the last 3 days as well. I think it's really great that we are starting to have that conversation, because at the beginning of when discourses around gender became very theoretical, the body kind of got lost in all of it. And I'm really glad that people are starting to talk about the body again more now.
Yeah, me too. Speaking of the body, is it wrong of me to be a little bit cynical and think that part of why Kim and Chloe didn't, part of why Kim didn't bear her last 2 pregnancies, and part of why Chloe's thinking of not bearing her next one is because of their very hard-won bodies. In pregnancy, you lose that gym body. I just felt very cynical. I've even wondered if the medical reasons for them not being able to carry pregnancies are 100% real, because of course for them their bodies are literally their livelihood, their everything, and to kind of lose them in a sense again through pregnancy would be something of a major setback. I'm probably being horrible and cynical, but the thought has crossed my mind.
It's crossed my mind as well. But then when you see endless scenes of pelvic exam after catheter removal, after having your uterine wall scraped, etc., it does give some credibility to the sort of physical impossibility of carrying another child. And then we could ask sort of in general, like, who gets to draw the line and where as to what is a recommended pregnancy and what isn't a recommended pregnancy. I mean, definitely an erupted placenta I think is quite widely considered as a producer of high-risk pregnancies in the future. So yeah, it might be that in Hollywood, they just draw the line quite a bit lower and say, you know what, let's not even go there anymore. You know, have somebody else do that for you. You have the money.
Yeah, for sure. There's a couple of questions in the chat, just little things that you can answer. One about a couple of books. Mallory says that they've been chastised in online forums suggesting something similar, yeah, regarding the maintenance of their bodies for surrogacy. I mean, it is a case of you can have your cake and eat it too, isn't it? It's you can keep this incredible body that looks exactly, you know, that really is a work of art, but you can have babies too because you can outsource it.
Yeah, I think of I haven't seen actually all seasons of the show, but I think I'm in like I finished season 9, and Kim, where I am not too long ago, gave birth to North, and then you know, once the birth is over, she gets right into the like working very hard to get her body back to the weight that it was before pregnancy and looking amazing. And she says, like, I'm going to be the hottest like young mom in the world or something. Like, I'm going to be the sexiest mom ever. And we can really see the anxiety for her and like getting back to the ideal body shape as fast as possible. She says, like, I have to, you know, North is going to wake up at 7 and I have to do my workout before then. It's like all this added work that she puts on herself that her career requires.
Yeah, extra maternal labour, just to belabor Siri's labouring metaphor again. Okay, thank you both so much for those wonderful, deep, rich papers. Lots of stuff in the chat there as well. Bravo, brava. Well done. We are now going to move on to our next session. So thank you. All right, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce a couple of the most interesting abstracts that came in. They were interesting to me because they were unexpected. They were not things that I'd previously really thought about in relation to the Kardashians. So we've called this session Time, Temporality and Trauma. And the first paper is called The End of an Era, Repetition as Futurity in Keeping Up with the Kardashians. And the speakers are Phoebe KAUFMAN and GEMMA GODFREY. GEMMA GODFREY is an interdisciplinary artist based in Los Angeles, where she moved after graduating from Bard College. She performs in an experimental art pop duo called Humours, and she co-hosts Money Can't Buy You Class, which is a podcast about the intersection of critical thought and reality TV. Then Phoebe KAUFMAN is a writer and artist based in Chicago. Her poetry's been featured on the Poetry Project's website and in Forever magazine, and her performance work has been included in the Anchoress Syndicate's My Smutty Valentine. Her monthly column for Forever magazine is called Return of the Real, and it focuses on the intersection of reality TV and critical theory. It can be found at forevermag.net. She also co-hosts Money Can't Buy You Class. Okay, so I'm handing over to GEMMA and Phoebe. Welcome. And
hi, thank you so much for having us. So yes, hi, my name is GEMMA and this is my collaborator Phoebe. And as Meredith said, we do host a podcast called Money Can't Buy You Class about the intersection of reality TV and critical theory, critical thought. And for a while now, we have had this kind of ongoing conversation about conceptualizing and discussing the end of the Kardashians and if there's an end, kind of what comes next. And so even though Keeping Up with the Kardashians is over, the Kardashians do, of course, still exist. And the Kardashians really are emblems of American culture, influencing fashion and makeup trends, speech patterns, body types, and even time. So now that their insistence to kind of keep up is ostensibly over, what is next for these self-rendered American pacekeepers? So as part of an understanding of that question, we're going to focus on themes of repetition in the Kardashian universe. It can be considered and understood as instances of infinity and the eternal return.
So the face of a Kardashian is symmetrical, the clothing is monochrome and beige, and time for them is infinite. Repetition is everywhere in the Kardashian universe, and so are allusions to infinity. Their daily lives repeat the same patterns of style, heartbreak, and matriarchal generation as they have since the show started. Even though their style may change, these changes always occur after a big life event. Khloe got a new face after Lamar, as Kim redid her closet after getting together with Kanye. These patterns of repetition ignore the notion of the linear. Repetition is similar to a cycle or a circle, forever repeating, turning, and returning. We wonder, though, what does this strange pattern of infinite repetition mean for the Kardashians, matriarchs of pop culture? So in 1968, French philosopher Gilles Deleuze published Difference in Repetition, where he mythopoetically destroys the Western obsession or habit of linear time, insisting that time operates according to repetition. But because this is Deleuze, there is not only one type of repetition, but three, each which correspond to three separate syntheses of time. So in this presentation, we will explore repetition and all its consequences as the driving force of the Kardashian universe. We want to focus on Deleuze's third synthesis of time, that of the future, and the Nietzschean concept of eternal return. To do so, we will focus on Skims marketing images and stills from the last two seasons of the Kardashians. These images are a way to explore the specific persistence of repetition through the visual language and aesthetic of the Kardashian clan.
So to begin with, and we'd like to do a close read of the color beige and all of its implications. And to do so properly, we really must begin in the cosmos. So in 2002, Ivan Baldry and Carl Glazebrook of Johns Hopkins University determined that the true color of the universe is cosmic latte, a tone of beige. That is how the human eye would see the color of outer space. Now, we're really interested in this process because it blended color and time, using combinations of light from over 200,000 galaxies around Earth that stretched to some 2 billion light years away, to create and name a visual representation of the infinite endlessness and ever expansion of outer space, beige. So to zoom in from outer space, we want to focus on the trope of beige in Kim Kardashian's wardrobe, and especially its persistence in her shapewear line Skims. Reading that through images from the 2019 one-year anniversary campaign of Skims, which was shot by artist Vanessa Beecroft. We argue that the formal mission of Skims is that of repetition, understood through the visual language of the color beige and the idea of the nude.
So since 2019, beige bandage-style dresses and otherwise monochrome outfits have become synonymous with Kim Kardashian. She's recently spotted wrapped up in her then-husband Kanye's streetwear brand, Yeezy. This propensity towards beige, such cosmic blend of a color, begs the question, does she want to blend in or stand out? As she's turned towards the nude and shapewear and away from early aughts bling, it seems her fame-oriented success rests in the notion of, as Natasha Stagg writes of the goal of the contemporary influencer, totally blending in. So this philosophy extends towards Skims, her shapewear brand. Deleuze writes, quote, "The third synthesis of time constitutes a future which affirms at once both the unconditioned character of the product in relation to the conditions of its production and the independence of the work in relation to its author or actor," end quote. we'd like to talk about Skims through this lens.
So Skims was launched in 2018 as a solutions-oriented brand, creating the next generation of underwear, loungewear, and shapewear. And what makes Skims unique, according to Kim, of course, is its universality. With 9 shades of nude and sizes ranging from extra, extra small to 4X, there is something for everybody. And shapewear, in its most basic understanding, is about blending with the body. Good shapewear should be invisible, offering an illusion for those wearing it. Ultimately, the goal of shapewear is to give women the opportunity to conform into the dominant shape of a woman and blend in with the crowd. The nude blend of Skims advertisement creates an irresistible sameness, a kind of irresistible bodily repetition that says to belong and to blend. Deleuze writes that repetition in the eternal return consists in conceiving the same on the basis of the difference. And while the mission of Skims is inclusivity for all women of all shapes, all colors, and all sizes, it is precisely this difference which is used as the basis for its uncanny repetition. This is further proved as Kim often takes center stage in many of these photographs, her body being the ideal, the different, as she stands among normal women of varying body types. These images are all part of Vanessa Beecroft's 2019 Skims campaign photo shoot. And what really strikes me about them is the kind of repetitive order that is imposed on these images. The women sort of disappear behind the camouflage of their spandex suits in straight-faced multiples. The images purport a message of multicultural, multitonal, and multi-shaped blend. The nude is exaggerated and everywhere. The women stand stiffly among each other like a tableau of live mannequins. Their bodies kind of collapse onto and into each other, creating a visual effect of endless multiplication. The models, like the garments, are barely there.
We want to make the connection here between galaxy star and pop star. Beige is the color of the endless space of the universe, and it is an image of infinite reflection and refraction. But beige is also the color of Kim and Skims, whose mission follows a process of blend similar to the scientific methodology of finding the color of the universe. So Deleuze writes that eternal return affects only the new, what is produced under the condition of default and by the intermediary of metamorphosis. It does not allow the sun to return since it presupposed its explosion. It concerns only the nebulae for which alone it moves and from which it becomes indistinguishable. Eternal return is itself the entirety of the always already preformed universe on the bleeding edge of becoming by exploding forth from a black hole. Skims, which shares a thematic color with such nebulae, is in fact creating the next generation of underwear, loungewear, and shapewear. As such, Skims is a visual representation of the eternal return. So we now want to pivot from the one-dimensional of color to the three-dimensional and discuss the concept and visual pattern of spherical infinity in terms of the Kardashians. So Deleuze writes, if the eternal return is a circle, then difference is at the center and the same is only on the periphery. It is a constantly decentered, continually tortuous circle, which revolves only around the unequal. As we've said, the eternal return is the third synthesis of time located in the future. It is a future-oriented version of time and the final stage of repetition. Almost karmically induced, it responds best to those who believe in it. I want to quickly note that this form of the eternal return that Deleuze discusses is predominantly based off of Nietzsche's formulation of it in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where in the middle of the night, a demon or an angel or just a being visits Zarathustra and poses the eternal return as a choice. Would you like to endlessly repeat your life and not know it? Or would you like your death to signify an end? I want to clarify, though, that the form of repetition, which is the eternal return, is less of a direct replication and more of a general proposition of what happens in the hypothetical infinity of the universe. If time and space go on forever, then of course the world in which we live is both possible elsewhere and also possible after this life in this world in this time. So similar to the way Deleuze orients the shape of the eternal return as a circle with difference in the center and the same on the periphery, the Kardashians are doubly consumed by the shape of the sphere. The sphere occupies their bodies, parties, and homes, insisting on the repeated aesthetic of infinitude and acting as a talisman of their infinity-oriented desires and beliefs.
So to kind of take a visual analysis of this kind of idea, in the first episode of the penultimate season of Keeping Up with the Kardashians, Khloe decorates the entrance to her friend Malika's baby shower with hundreds of nude colored balloons. And the guests sort of walk through this over the top archway. Brown, white, cream, pink, and beige globules are kind of multiplying and birthing themselves from the walls around them. And I'm kind of obsessed with how much these images really sort of look like organic, like a body, maybe even an intestine or a vaginal canal. And the balloons are also interesting because they both mimic mini pregnant bellies, and yet they're also there as the symbol of celebration for the expecting mother. And so in talking about a sphere, we would be remiss not to mention the symbol of the pregnant belly, especially as we all know how pregnancy is a recurring theme in the Kardashians. Countless episodes over the past 20 seasons have followed the sisters as they go from fertility clinic to fertility clinic, trying as hard as they can to become pregnant in any way that they can. And we see this as a metaphor for both their insistence of the continuation of their family line and name, as well as a kind of symbol and ode to the sphere, which kind of perfectly encapsulates the formless infinity of the eternal return. Because you have the belly, which is rounded, but to go further inside the belly, there is a human life forming and changing that is preparing to begin its own life. And as pregnancy and birth are kind of the most essentially understood cycles of the circle of life, there is also a perfect encapsulation of this idea of this formless sort of infinity that's always churning on.
So what we're trying to say is that this bodily spheritude is the ultimate Kardashian achievement, especially if we can understand pregnancy as a bodily architecture. Of course, though, the Kardashian world has space for other spheres. Images from Kim's maternity line focus on the smooth roundness of expectant stomachs, one in every color. And even her brand name, Skims, uses the round sliding consonant S as an almost uterine lining around her name.
So once you become cognizant of Kim's obsession with the sphere, it really starts to pop up everywhere. Her mansion, which is of course the color of cosmic latte, is full of rounded edges and spheres. It matches the shape of her body, which you can really see in her Vogue 72 Questions video. You see her curves as she sachets through her arched beige hallways in a monochrome charcoal outfit, pointing out her erotically rounded grand piano and her kitchen countertop, on which you can see a large geode in the shape of a donut, a circle without a center.
So Kim's interior design is similar to the aesthetic ethos of her maternity line. In episode 7 of season 20, Kim describes her upcoming interior design plans to her mom, Kris Jenner, planning for a huge circular couch, no doubt to accent her spherical ottomans. Kim is opposed to edges. Her bosom and butt are draped in soft, solid color fabrics, always. She has no edges, she keeps going. Her own body, constantly drenched in nude, becomes a walking talisman of infinity and forever.
even in the production and aesthetic of the show, with that kind of blurred pinkish background they use for interviews, really places the family in a sort of void space, a kind of endless, formless space that repeats behind them, making them sort of hard to locate. So in the final season, there are several episodes dedicated to recollection. They are symbolically closing the chapter of this leg of their journey and giving the audience an ending as well, a kind of neat, clean ending. Two episodes specifically come to mind for me. The first is the time capsule episode, where they each put a different Kardashian branded item to rest for eternity. And the second is the episode where they play a scavenger hunt of memories. And in both these episodes, the memories and mementos and objects of nostalgia are all based on plot lines that have served the show's purpose or items that have served their brands and capital. And in these later seasons, there really is rarely new content on the show. And I see them as really reusing and repurposing their own past, their own brand, their own self-image as this kind of generative thing to make new content. And of course, that can go on forever, as they will always make their own content and they will always drive forward using those tactics.
At the same time, as we've discussed, Deleuze believes that the third synthesis of time, operating hand in hand with the third type of repetition, is akin to a messianic future. So if an individual reaches a present tense of the eternal return, they would be the Messiah. They would have already arrived in the always already, not yet present of the end of the present tense present. But no. We do not believe the Kardashians are the Messiah. Instead, what their repeated aesthetic tendencies portray is a desire for the infinitude of the messianic space of the eternal return. Deleuze writes, "Art does not imitate, above all because it repeats. It repeats all the repetitions by virtue of an internal power. An imitation is a copy, but art is simulation. It reverses copies into simulacra. The reason great art matters is, see as I see," the Sun tells the poet ARIANNE a couple years ago. It's in her book, A Sam Book. Great book. The Kardashians, through their chosen art form, are sharing with the viewer, with us, their vision of the world. The chosen rhythm of the Kardashians is repetition, their chosen time frame is infinity, and their chosen art form is advertisement. And if, as Deleuze writes, infinite representation is a memory which conserves, then the Kardashians have already enacted their own foreverness, displaying their desire for infinity within the realm of cultural memory. They have dug their own graves, but instead of digging, they're filming, photographing, designing, and marketing. And instead of death as a signifier of ending, death is instead symbolic of endless continuation. In this way, repetition goes beyond the material objects of cloth, balloon, or even televised narrative structure, in the same way that, for example, for ancient Egyptian royalty, the tomb is structured as a gateway to an afterlife. Their artwork, or at least the formal representations they approve, act in, and endorse, is a ritual act of art, preparing themselves for eternal life. This is their enactment of eternity through repetition, which of course is art in its most Deleuzian form, that of the simulacra. Thank you. That's it. That's all we've got.
That's our presentation.
That's all, they say modestly. Thank you both so much. I did not know that a close reading of Beige was missing from my life, but it definitely was, and now I have it. And, you know, some beautiful interactions there between continental philosophy and the Kardashians. Very, very well done. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for you. Thank you both. We're going to move straight on to our next paper, which is by OLINE EATON. I hope I've pronounced that right, OLINE.
OLINE.
OLINE, okay. Okay, OLINE EATON. The title of this paper is "I Don't Want to Sound Like I'm Not Grateful," and it's on Kim Kardashian, trauma, and lost time. So OLINE Eaton teaches writing and rhetoric at Howard University and at New York University, DC. Her research examines celebrity life narratives as transmedially constructed, transhistorically contested, ideologically saturated, affective spaces. So thank you, and I will hand over.
Right, thank you so much. Let me share my screen really quickly. And I've been darting in and out of this conference outside of teaching and sleeping, and it has been such an amazing experience. So I just wanted to thank all of the presenters and organizers and Meredith. It's been amazing. I also want to draw your attention. I have a content warning here. This is a paper on trauma and assault. So it covers some rather difficult ground, and I just ask that you please take care of yourselves. So, in the early hours of October 3rd, 2016, armed gunmen physically assaulted and robbed Kim Kardashian West while she was in Paris for Fashion Week. They stole the ring she'd recently posted images of on social media, as you can see here, along with other jewelry. So I'm interested in this episode from Kardashian's life because it illuminates a dynamic I've spent the whole of my own academic life looking at, which is how we as human beings in the Western world specifically, working with the text of Western media more specifically, grapple with the collision of biographical and historical facts. To be clear, I have absolutely no reason to believe these texts do not operate, or they operate less powerfully beyond the Western context. But also I know I'm not the scholar to speak to that experience. What I can speak to is how these narratives work in the US, a context that admittedly through 75 plus years of cultural imperialism has considerable reach. As a connected aside, just yesterday on Twitter, Brittany Luce, in discussion of Kardashian's Met Ball outfit, identified her as one of our, meaning America's, most impactful cultural exports as a nation. My work focuses on how Americans make sense of these narratives of other people's lives as best we can in the moment when the outcomes remain radically unknown, only to culturally cut and paste them later. And even further on, to have others cut and paste them again and again, retrofitting stories to meet the needs of the current cultural moment. The moment in which the story, the event, is being commemorated and or retold. So think of it as like the spiraling out of the story across anniversaries and cultural products and movies and documentaries and things like that. How the story changes and morphs over time. It's a text in constant motion, reiterated and therefore evolving over in and through time. So Kardashian intrigued me initially as a biographer because I had no idea how anyone could write the story of her life in a way that would be at once compelling and all-encompassing, especially given the extremity of its transmediation. And I'm going to euphemize it just this once, the Paris incident seemed to even further complicate that possibility, which is why I started writing about it in the first place many years ago. What came to fascinate me later was that it seemed to have been very quickly forgotten by most people. Probably not many people here today, but in October of 2019, while I was working on an earlier iteration of this talk for a journal article that would soon be rejected, I asked my students if they remembered this event involving Kim Kardashian, and they recalled it, but they characterized it as having happened a long time ago. And when I told them that it had at that point been 3 years, they were astounded. They thought it was much, much longer. Next month, it will have been exactly 5 years. So in writing about, I've been writing about this incident since just the December after it occurred, when I proposed a paper on it and that you're seeing a black screen right now, when I proposed a paper on it for a life writing conference taking place in June of 27. That conference was on the subject of social media. I was interested then in the idea of how we write stories when they're still unfolding. And because proposing that paper in December of 2016, Kim Kardashian was not on social media at the time. She'd retreated from public life. So I didn't know if she would ever come back. I had no idea what her presence would look like in June of 2017 at the time I proposed that paper. None of us did. In the introduction to a Kardashian-themed issue of Critical Studies in Fashion and Beauty, published around that time, Meredith Jones observed that Kardashian was then, quote, in self-imposed seclusion, while her 40+ million followers, Twitter followers, waited for a sign from her. A spokesperson from the E! Network informed Us Weekly that filming had ceased on Keeping Up with the Kardashians, and Vanity Fair's reporting suggests that the family might be ready to turn off the cameras for good. Spoiler alert, that did not happen. In continuing to write about this incident after Kardashians returned to public life that January of 2017, and then throughout the Trump presidency, I focused on it in relation to the idea of lost time. In the Proustian sense, and whatever the hell we mean by that, but also the possibly less obvious sense of the lost time incident, which is the American terminology associated with worker injury and a loss of productive work. Spinning off those notions, I forged my own definition. So for me, at this point in time, lost time is about times where the language fails. Times wherein the actors, by which I think I basically just mean people living their lives, are robbed both of control and of frameworks for understanding. Time wherein, as a result, work is lost, whether through violence or injury or cultural forces or cognitive stress or any combination and or all of the above. These are perhaps, not coincidentally, oftentimes that society as a whole, for whatever reason, is eager to erase and forget. Writing from within an ongoing pandemic, a time that has been conceived as a deviation from normal and wherein people are constantly scurrying to regain normal, a time of mass trauma and mass death, this eagerness for erasure and collective forgetting seems an incredibly important reality to keep in view. Lost time is for me at once time that is constructed as culturally, capitalistically unproductive, but also it maybe is time for which the language does not yet, for the individual involved, exist. Time before an encounter with the vocabulary that gives sense and legitimacy to the experience. Trauma time might be another word for it. That's a lot. We're not going to do all of that today. What I want to focus on here, as the tiny part of the broader mess around Kim Kardashian that I'm looking at, is specifically language and the idea of aftermath. How essentially language was applied in the aftermath of the assault, and how in turn the language applied seems to have, in the aftermath of the aftermath, shaped Kardashian's presentation of what happened to her. So language is slippery. Its meaning historically confined and yet also transhistorical. So encoded with the language and our use of it today lay the permission structures and the niceties of yore. So it's locker room talk, not a boast of sexual assaults. Similarly, it's roughhousing, not rape, and in this case, robbery rather than assault. 20 years ago while in college, a man I was in a romantic relationship with raped me multiple times. For 2 decades, lacking phrases like coercive control and intimate partner violence, I communicated this experience through vague references to a bad relationship. Because the moral binary of good relationships and bad relationships was all that I had, because I did not know that rape could occur within long-term relationships, because I thought date rape only applied to the first date, because I did not encounter the term acquaintance rape for 15 years. I did not have the words for what had been done to me. Still, even now, though they're appropriate, though they help, still the words often feel rather too harsh sometimes. Often I think we take entirely too much care not to name, though to be clear, this is not our fault. Sometimes it's protective, a trauma response. We do not want to admit to our own realities, and our brains will not let us sometimes as well. We do not want to admit to other times, or even within those same times, it's because we lack the vocabulary for our own experience, whether due to its inaccessibility, its non-existence, or its failure to find us. The templates are few and far between, and confronted with trauma, we tend to grab hold of the language that greets us, the language our culture has to offer. Very quickly, that telling, rooted in the language and stories of the day, calcifies and becomes the story told ever after, even as language that gives shape and meaning to those experiences is forged anew. Language evolves. Stories often prove significantly harder to shift. So think for a moment about how the notion of changing your story is frowned upon, how it impacts one's credibility, how so suddenly it makes you look like a liar. In the aftermath of the events in Paris, there was a marked lack of empathy for Kardashian. Less than 24 hours after the incident, the Daily Mail published a piece which essentially blamed the victim for her own assault. I sometimes feel like the Daily Mail's headlines are deliberately designed to look ludicrous in a bibliography. So accordingly, this article I've chosen to focus on here has the ridiculous title of "As ratings for Keeping Up with the Kardashians keep falling, is it any wonder Kim's gunpoint ordeal is seen by some as a huge PR stunt," writes Alison Boshoff. So the article opens with 5 paragraphs on Kardashian's jewelry and its appearance on her social media accounts. There's the stolen 20-carat diamond ring, we're told, which has replaced her original 15-carat engagement ring. The prices of all of these things are included. Kardashian had shared an image of both rings with her followers on Instagram 2 weeks prior. And these quantitative details are leavened with the Daily Mail's qualitative analysis. So here we see Alison Boshoff writes, "Good taste aside, the mother of 2 who was robbed at gunpoint by 5 masked men who tied her up in the bathroom of a luxury Paris apartment in the early hours of Monday while they stole 7.8 million pounds of jewelry may now be reflecting that it could have been a tad unwise to show off her wealth so ostentatiously." So when we take the breaking news out of this, when we remove the violence, actually that giant clause in the middle, note what we are left with. The mother of 2 may now be reflecting that it could have been a tad unwise to show off her wealth so ostentatiously. This article literally went up the morning of the morning that Kim Kardashian was assaulted. In this article, Boshoff simultaneously attacks the quote, "cruel suggestion that Kardashian staged the assault to improve her show's ratings," while detailing what people at Paris Fashion Week were saying about this possibility, asserting that, quote, "Kim Kardashian West is no stranger to a PR stunt," and cataloging her near, quote, "decade of exhibitionism." Thus, the article works to actually provide evidentiary support for the theory that it was a stunt. By the article's end, Kardashian is established as, quote, "a reality TV star with no discernible talent save for self-promotion, one who is, quote, untroubled by any obvious talent. And yet, in spite of this, she has become one of the most famous and wealthiest women in the world." She is, Boshoff writes, quote, "hardly shy about sharing the details of her lavish lifestyle. And it was, quote, her private life and her talent for making money which made keeping up with the Kardashians a phenomenon. In turn, quote, Kim's love of selfies and readiness to unveil her spectacular figure has helped her to become a genuine social media phenomenon. Her 48.3 million Twitter followers are treated to a steady stream of banal thoughts and titillating images." So here, Boshoff revels in the details of Kardashian's rise to fame, while simultaneously condemning her for it, vacillating wildly between moral outrage over Kardashian's consumption, vanity, sex tape, social media usage, but also open awe of the money she has earned for it. This is characteristic of the Mail's coverage of Kardashian in general and coverage of the assault in particular. A strong element of victim blaming coursed through the reporting after the assault, suggesting essentially that because Kardashian lived the life she did and posted photographs of her jewelry on social media, this was all her fault. This response was culturally pervasive and easily adopted in other realms. In writing this talk, I've identified the victim blaming discourse as something I need to dig into more deeply, though it doesn't sound fun at all, but especially as it surfaced extra textually in things like this horrendous Paris heist robbery victim costume. But I'm going to stick to language and lost time here. Have you noticed that I've been referring to what happened to Kardashian as an assault, rather than the more commonly used robbery? This is language I've assigned it rather than the language Kardashian has used herself. I don't know how she talks about this at the moment. She's not talked about this period of her life for a while, though there was a brief reference to it in one of the episodes of Keeping Up's final season. To rob is to take property unlawfully from a person or place by force or threat of force. To assault is to make a physical attack on someone. Kardashian fell victim to both in her suite on October 3rd, 2016. And yet the media primarily covered the story as a robbery. I've actually heard the phrase robbery used a few times here too. It's a framework that is conveniently more hospitable for the building narrative at the time that this was a morality tale about consumption and a just punishment for Kardashian's audacity at having ambiguous talent and too many diamond rings. Kardashian was both robbed and assaulted. It wasn't one or the other, it was both. So I'm overcorrecting here and privileging the term previously absent and excluding the term more popularly used. But I think it's an important point to make. They put tape on her mouth and bound her hands and held her at gunpoint, and she thought she was going to die. To be clear, this is not a hierarchy. To be robbed is traumatic, as is being assaulted. Both involve legal and psychological frameworks of violence and violation. However, paired, they invoke a level of trauma that the language used to describe Kardashian's experience and in the media and then in culture more broadly, continuing in the last 5 years, seems to have in turn robbed her. Discussing what happened to her outside of the episode of Keeping Up with the Kardashians that covered these events, Kardashian both recounted and supported the media narratives of her experience. In an April 2017 interview with Ellen DeGeneres, for example, about 6 months after the robbery assault, Kardashian endorsed both the media's indictment of her materialism and their subsequent interpretation that she had been reborn as a less materialistic person. She told DeGeneres, "I feel like that was so meant to happen to me. Like I'm such a different person. Like I was, it's probably no secret. You see it on the show and us being flashy. Like I was definitely materialistic before. And not that there's anything bad with having things and working hard to get those things, but I just don't care about that stuff anymore. I really don't. It's just not worth it. Even though there's nothing truly, it's okay if you're proud of that. It's just not who I am anymore." The equivocation here is striking. How she tries not to condemn one mode of living as she claims another for herself. It emerges in the way she and DeGeneres discuss the assault, which DeGeneres repeatedly euphemizes as the Paris incident, a phrase that itself minimizes the trauma, even as DeGeneres explicitly states that it was a horrific experience for Kardashian. In this interview, Kardashian too took pains to minimize what had happened. To DeGeneres, she described the assault as 7 or 8 nights of torture, during which she thought she might die. But then she pivoted to allow that it could have been way worse, so I don't want to sound like I'm not grateful. She situated what had happened to her on a scale in which essentially, because it was not rape, it was not assault. Because she did not die, she must be publicly, effusively grateful and also repentant of her materialistic past. How quickly victims must begin fighting, converting feelings into logic, Chanel Miller writes in her amazing memoir, Know My Name. And how quickly also we must slot ourselves into a story that is recognizable, whether it be a morality tale or a narrative of vengeance or the story of the good victim. The templates are few and far between, and we grab hold of the language that greets us. Turning to Kim Kardashian's statements following the assault, after researching the media response, I was astonished by how closely the two aligned. And that is not to negate Kardashian's framing of the experience whatsoever, but rather just to note the bending of the story, like a plant toward the light. In my teaching of writing, I go on and on to my students about connotation versus denotation and the necessity of defining our terms. We must all of us define and clearly state our terms because we do not use the language the same way, because what we are trying to learn is communication, and communication is really fucking hard. But what I've never really accounted for in my classes is the time when language evades us. Not just the words we don't know and the vocabulary we don't have, but where the language is not available to us. The language is not built for our experience. It is difficult to account for the times when the words shut us out, or when we refuse them or reject them, or when all we have is words that encourage us to blame ourselves. I construct lost time as the times where language fails, traumatic failures of language. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you. That was very moving in many ways. Yeah, you can say I'm a little bit lost for words. Thank you. Yeah, really, really, really wonderful. Okay, let's gather our thoughts and see if anybody has questions or comments. Please feel free to put hands up. Feel free to write in the chat. And also, of course, presenters, feel free to ask each other questions if you have any.
May I ask a question of the other presenters? Did any other colors come up for you? Or is it just big and predominant?
Well, I think just the kind of spectrum of nudes was really what always stuck out to us. I mean, I guess now with the Met Gala, we could have, I mean, it was like the timing. I think if we had had a little more, I think we would have put that black in there and kind of discussed that. And I think there's also a discussion to be done about, you know, skin color and race in that conversation of blend that we didn't really touch on this time, because we wanted to kind of make sure we stayed focused because there was a lot of material. But yeah, does another color come to your mind?
No, it's just curious. Because I think I was thinking about the garishness of the early seasons and stuff. It really, your presentation was amazing.
Oh, thank you.
Like how frantic, in retrospect to the minimalism now, how frantic and maximalist the early years were and stuff.
Well, I think it ties in. Oh, no, go ahead, Phoebe.
I was just gonna say, yes, it's beige, but I think that we were also trying to articulate like the aesthetic of what beige is as like itself a blend, itself like a blend of this strange endlessness of outer space. So I think that even, you know, if you can think of a color as like a formal aesthetic, you know what I mean? I think that that was something that we were really interested in.
But I think it ties into what you were talking about with the anti-materialistic monochrome era is very tied together, you know, like that, the assault, the robbery, you know, really marked her fashion change, you know, to like doing the more, you know, like the Yeezy all one color kind of no blingy stuff. And that's informed, you know, both of their aesthetics. I think moving forward, I think that's like totally Kanye's fashion aesthetic now. And even the Balenciaga, I mean, the Balenciaga Met Gala, like, you know, completely covered is like a real argument to be made about, you know, her standing in the public and how she wants to be seen or something, you know.
Hannah in the chat has just looped back to Queen of Contouring and saying that the beige ties in with that Queen of Contouring label that Kim has.
Yeah, for sure.
My question really is, what, I know we can't see into the future, but what can you do after beige? Like, we know that we know that reinvention is going to continue to happen. We know that part of this infinite cycle is change. So the beige will have to go at some point or be changed in some way. And I guess, you know, we just have to wait to see. Yeah.
Well, I think that you can see a lot with, as Gemma was just saying, with the Met Gala and the Balenciaga, right? Where, you know, Kim Kardashian like kind of miraculously made herself into a two-dimensional shadow, right? And you see all those memes even of her next to Kendall, and people are making jokes like me and my anxiety showing up to a party. But what really struck me was that she was immediately recognizable as Kim Kardashian. So I think that, you know, inching towards the future, I think that especially as these women get older, right? I think that the trend is going to be to cement yourself so physically in the cultural memory, or physically, but also metaphorically or whatever, that they're going to be recognizable without their faces. You know, they're going to kind of like become this type of like air or this type of like overall vibe instead of there being an actual material trend. I think it's going to become, you know, you even saw Kim, you know, you have the time capsule and the bunker and the hologram were big themes in season 20. So I think that they're moving into a more metaphysical realm.
Yeah.
Fascinating. OLINE, there's a question here in the chat for you. Can you think of any other public figures that are such acceptable hate objects for such a victim-blaming joke costume? That's the Halloween costume. Do you think, are there any others that could be imaginable?
I think one of the, and don't worry about the autocorrect, since I get it from my students all the time. I think that there are a lot of people, which is horrifying, but a lot of them, if you think about the sort of 20-year reckoning that we're having currently with maybe Monica Lewinsky, Paris Hilton, Britney Spears, Janet Jackson, those are all people who there would have been Halloween costumes about 15 to 20 years ago that they might not have been sold for $70, but people would have gotten an umbrella and made fun of Britney, and that would have been totally fine. It wouldn't have been fine, but it would have been recognized as okay at the time. And so I think this one in particular is quite shocking because it's 2016. It's like a year before Me Too. It's a week literally, which I think is partly why the assault has a strange standing in history. It's a week before the Access Hollywood tape from Trump. And so it's coming right at the beginning of the cultural reckoning that's about a year away with these types of things. But I'm not even sure within that victim blaming has been a big part of that discourse. So I think it's an ongoing thing. But certainly we seem to reckon with it, but it takes a really, really long time. And I don't know when we're going to get to that point with Kim Kardashian and actually taking this thing that happened to her seriously.
Yeah.
There was a bit of pushback on this, though. I think the company pulled the costume eventually, but it got a lot of coverage and a lot of outcry at the time, so that's a little bit different. But it made it through marketing meetings and was produced.
Yeah. Lida, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Hi, everyone. It's more like a comment than a question, but I was just thinking regarding Kim's assault experience, that apart from the language factor and the general public's, inclination to disregard and diminish and in general not believe women's experiences on violence and assault, that the public also has the urge when something like that happens to rich people to be happy, like it's fair. And they show this complete lack of empathy towards them. And then all the comments that they're doing, they're just completely disrespectful, not only towards the celebrities that had this experience, but I think towards all victims, because if I had an experience like Kim and then I was reading all these comments and I was seeing all these articles, that would be an attack indirect to me and my experience. And I would just adapt to that and then also think, oh yeah, it's my fault. I did something too, right? So I think it's also like in this kind of incidents also class thing that you suddenly feel powerful because they got it bad for once. And yeah, that's my comment.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And the point you make about it like trickling down and other people who are not famous, who've had these experiences, seeing how this person and their experience is treated publicly. Yeah, it's really powerful, I think. There was a bit, go ahead. Okay.
No, I have a question for you, but continue answering.
I was just gonna point out that James Corden made there's a familiar trajectory with these things. I feel like if he did something, she's a wife, mother, daughter, and then all of feminist Twitter came after him and was like, she's a human being too. So there's there was a lot of side discussion about even people who were trying to be empathetic could only do that in a very particular way, that she had to be associated to other people and in a family dynamic rather than just, oh, this is the terrible thing that happened.
Yeah, so I have a question that I guess like zooms out a little bit further, like I guess I personally just think that being that wealthy, like, is itself a crime? You know what I mean? And I don't think that you should own that many millions of dollars of jewelry, right? You even saw at the Met Gala, right? This is happening days after the pandemic. Unemployment insurance in the United States is over. People are like being evicted. I wonder how, I guess, the notion of empathy or the notion of like criminalized wealth and what is a crime and what isn't a crime. It's almost like a Robin Hood type thing. I wonder like if that's something that that ties into your work or your presentation or.
Yeah, it hasn't really. I'm really focusing on the more of just trying to this is a very long thing and I'm not sure where it's going to go, but just kind of reckoning with the language that's used around these things and using her and E. Jean Carroll and people's reluctance to publicly, or people's
incapability at the specific times in their lives to apply words that when you're watching them on TV, you're like, that's not what that was. Like, that's clearly so obvious. And I get this to my students, they'll make disclosures about bad dates and I'm like, oh, I know what happened to you. So it's kind of a meditation on that. And so I don't engage too much with their incredible wealth and the way that plays into it, other than talking about it in terms of a lost time incident where there was a bit of discussion in like Business Week about how much money she was losing from not tweeting every day. And because this started out looking at her specifically in relation to that social media absence, that comes in a little bit, but it might not actually make it to the final product. Cool.
Yeah, that discussion of lost time, I really liked, and I feel like there's a connection to be made between our two projects in that way, because, you know, I think Phoebe and I are very concerned with like the way that the time structures of the Kardashians, like how they dictate their own time and things like that. And, you know, this idea of lost time, especially with the show ending, is like, what does that mean? They have their time back, or is their time actually like more, is their time lost because we aren't, or what's our relationship to that? Because we are not getting to see them. And, you know, even the black hole Balenciaga dress, you know, this kind of like idea of their things are being like, things are, yeah, like their time, they're no longer letting their time be so blatantly commodified with the show. I think that like the conversation of lost time with the ending of the show makes for an interesting thought, because of the way that the show was so obviously like productive time, or happen, it was such real time, you know.
Yeah, and also and I'm curious to see how I wonder what the aesthetics of the Hulu show will be, if there'll be like a cataclysmic split where there's a new aesthetic all of a sudden. But the lost time between like the Daily Mail's coverage of what's happening yesterday versus like 4 months later when you watch it on the show, I think that's another tension there of like, we've read about this and now we're going to see their authorized account, their reenactment of it or whatever. It's an interesting split there.
Yeah, we've talked about that a lot too, like this kind of idea of the timeline fractures and how that maybe is informing this next era of not having a show, because social media is so quick to go that we kind of know everything that's you know, we're watching the last season and Kourtney and Scott are professing, you know, they're saying Kourtney and Scott might get back together, but we know that Kourtney is like happier than ever with Travis Barker. So like, how it doesn't really work anymore. I think that they are having to adjust to this new kind of time structure and this new kind of like social media. Like, I think it's just gotten, obviously there's always been social media, but I think with TikTok and the way that things are filmed, like it's just happening so quickly that the format of reality TV that they are doing like doesn't quite work as well anymore.
And it's been interesting to see how they did that, how they started like including their Snapchats a couple of seasons ago.
Yeah.
Like they've made hesitant steps, but it wasn't obviously going to adequately cover it all.
Yeah, for sure.
There's a question here in the chat from Maureen. They say this panel's been amazing. It's interesting to see which narratives or moments become spherical and are allowed to continually return and which are terminated. And I think, you know, obviously Gemma and Phoebe can speak to that, but it also ties in with OLINE's paper, because Kim herself seems to have terminated the narrative about the assault, and I will always refer to it as an assault and robbery from now on. Thanks for that. Yeah. So yeah, what do you all think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the show, you know, I was saying a little bit towards the end of our presentation, I'm really interested in this idea of the narratives that they create being things that they're repurposing from their, like, you know, the kind of constant references back to the pranks, the kind of like, they're always kind of reusing their own material to create a plot line. And I feel like that is a very spherical thing. And I think that the way that we're talking about the media and like the lost time between Daily Mail and then there's an interview, that there is kind of like things have to, and with their show coming after, you know, the time after it happened, it's like things are always, they're actually didn't really think about it like that, but like they are kind of being met with these things from their past constantly, because things have already happened and then they're filming it. And I think Kourtney said that in the reunion, and she's like, and then you have to watch it. And it's like they are kind of constantly being met once again with these things that have already happened to them. So that might be, I don't know if that's really an answer, but I just thought of that.
It's kind of like they're subjected to those Facebook, here's what you were doing 5 years ago posts, but like in a giant way around the world. And those can be really disruptive in your day in a really small way of like, oh man, it's been that long. So I can't imagine, especially if it's traumatic things they're doing, since they're talking about really personal stuff, and like just constantly having people weigh in as well.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, there's lots of good, really great comments there in the chat. I'm so impressed and in awe of you three. Just brilliant papers. Thank you so much. We're going to move on to our next session, and please do join us for our final session. Don't forget about that today, where we'll talk about ways forward for publishing, etc.